So, yeah, I'm going to segue actually now and bring in Austin Cooper, who is the managing editor of Our House series, what the Washington Informer has been working on. And Austin, how are you?
Fine. How are you? Good to see you, Denise.
Likewise, likewise. And we're also going to bring on the Priestleys, Cassius and Jacqueline Priestley. Welcome to Win TV.
Hi, Denise. Hi, Austin.
Hey there. How are you?
All right, thanks for having us.
Oh, I would say it's a pleasure, but it's a pleasure to meet you. But when we talk about this issue of housing, and actually we should be praising you all for being advocates in a field where we know that what Black homeowners are going through as it relates to appraisals, and what you all are doing to speak on behalf of them is good, but it's unfortunate that we're still here in this place. Austin, I'm going to really turn it over to you right now and see if you can talk about, begin our conversation about the White House meeting earlier this week and the fact that the Priestleys were participating in that meeting.
Well, thank you, Denise, and hello, Cassius and Jackie. Good to have you on the program. So I'd like to start out with how you all were invited, became a part of this process at the White House. I believe it was on Wednesday, correct?
That is correct. So we had a home appraisal done last year, so 2022, and we challenged our appraisal. There was some coverage around it, and the HUD task force, the PAVE task force, had heard about our situation and asked us to come and share our story as they released the action plan from the Biden-Harris administration.
Austin, I think you're muted. Okay. So what? Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Denise.
We're going ahead. Go ahead. Yeah. So, we've looked at redlining. I know that the White House has come up with an initiative. Secretary was there as well to talk with you all about how we address this whole issue of unfair appraisals. I mean, you all had a situation, as you said, when your house was appraised for one amount and neighbor's house was appraised for $1 million more. And we're seeing this happen all over the country. Do you think that this initiative that the White House has instituted and President Biden's commitment to making a change is what kind of work needs to be done? And are people communicating enough about the challenges that they're facing?
I think you point out something. I think it's interesting because I think in the Black community, I think the situations vary. In some communities where you have more of a mixed community, you can do what they call obviously whitewashing your home, and that may help to increase the value. But in our case, being in Prince George's County, we're in a predominantly African American community. So the assumption is that it's African American. If you're there, then your neighbors are as well. So the option of whitewashing our home was not an option. What happened for us was there's a distinct difference between our costs. So we had a home built, we lived in Prince George's County prior. We made a conscious decision to continue to live in Prince George's County. We looked at some of the neighboring counties in Montgomery County, Fairfax County, and others. And it just felt right to us. This is an area that, our kids live. They have friends in the area. And it's something too, I think kids at times growing up in an environment around people that look like them. And that was important to us, having three young boys. And so we decided to double down on the county and build our second home in the county. And the why behind we built the second home, we needed more space. We needed a home that can accommodate multi-generation. So we did just that. And what was interesting during the appraisal process, going in, you heard the rumors about homes in Prince George's County. They don't appraise comparable to homes in surrounding counties. So we knew that going in. But what was interesting and challenging was the disparity in the value of our home compared to what we thought it was. And obviously that was greater and exacerbated when you look at the disparity to the exact same home built in Montgomery County by the exact same builder, essentially sold for $1 million more than what I was appraised for. And that disparity just shouldn't happen. And so
Cassius, how did you discover that? Where did you, I mean, at what point did you say something's wrong here and let me check? I mean, I know you all have backgrounds in banking and PR, so you're not like the average person who's getting an appraisal, but something for you to do your research and what was it?
No, Denise, I'll say this, that throughout our process of deciding where do we go next in terms of our family, in terms of moving, and how do we approach it, our decisions were always rooted in biblical principles, in terms of how we spend our money, in terms of how we decide what's most important. And I really have to say that we really were guided through our whole process. In that we are not the most savviest of consumers, right? We are informed because of the work that we do. But at the end of the day, we don't know what we don't know, right?
Right.
So we always were able to go through this process with a sense of calm and confidence, and things would be revealed to us. In terms of understanding the realization of the sale price of that other home, it's simply because it was listed and it sold, and we could do a Google search and we saw what the sales price was for that home. And it was infuriating to know that a house that was built by the exact same builder, less than 20 miles from us, sold for $1 million more than our house would appraised for. And your question about the Biden administration and this PAVE task force and their action plan, I think it's a huge step towards addressing a long-standing systemic and structural problem that has, in many respects, gone unnoticed or unaddressed. So appraisal bias is one of the many issues that are tied to inequitable housing practices in the US. But to really hone in on what the aspects are that can be addressed was monumental. I mean, the administration, really led by Secretary Fudge from HUD, maps out point by point what the administration is going to do, and it tackles everything from expanding the workforce of appraisers. There's only 2% of all appraisers in the U.S. are Black. 2% of all appraisers, and the problem with that is that typically in that field, you get into the business through an apprenticeship. And so if you don't have someone who looks like you to groom you and to create a pathway for you to become an appraiser, it's going to remain largely white as it is. And so the fact that the administration was so thoughtful, for example, in understanding that is an important pathway that they have to create for appraisers, for example, was huge. But not only that, regulatory standpoint, from the algorithms that are used.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. I hate to cut you off, but I want to. What does that mean when you talk about algorithmic bias? Explain that to our viewers.
Sure. So if our home value was suppressed from the beginning, if historically Black-owned homes have been suppressed in value, and you use data to determine the value of a Black-owned home, you're using false data. So the basic premise of your approach is flawed from the very beginning, because of historical redlining, right? And so they have to correct the algorithms to factor in those human flaws that have skewed the value of Black-owned homes.
Amazing. So, where are you now? What has happened, with the appraisal process? I know you were able to sell your other home, but tell me where you are in this process and what your movement is doing now that personally impacted you.
So we had an appraisal. One of the
Mm-hmm.
challenges of the appraisal, it increased to $100,000. It was still $400,000 less than the cost to build our home. And that really inspired myself. You mentioned my neighbors at the start, Denise, and I want to just clarify, all of us had suppressed appraisals here. So in my neighborhood, everyone's appraisal was capped at the same amount, and yet our homes are not similar other than the fact that they have bedrooms and bathrooms and we share a street. And so that led us to say, we are going to break down the issues, the barriers and the opportunities And we want to do it so we arm consumers with information on how to protect themselves, how to be their own advocates. We want to bring attention to this because while this happens all over the country, in the greater Washington area, we have a high minority population, a high Black population. In Prince George's County, more than 79% of all residents are of minority race, meaning non-white. 61% of the residents here are African American and Black. So this hits us differently in the greater Washington area, and this hits us especially hard here in Prince George's County. And so we've done great work to kind of understand how we can help consumers, how we can bring this to the attention of the Maryland General Assembly, the role that we can have as consumers in working with HUD, for example. But more than anything, being an advocate, like I always say, if you were 20 years old and you were trying to buy $100,000 house or $200,000 house in this market, quite frankly.
I was about to say, do they exist anymore? But go ahead.
Where?
Home in 1990 something here, but and if your home doesn't appraise for the sale price, you're going to either have to bring the cash or make a different decision about where to live, and likely pay more for that home because you had to make that tough decision to live where that wasn't your first choice. And so our work through the Fair and Unbiased Appraisal Advocates is to ensure that every home owner and home seller knows their rights, knows their resources, know the work that's being done, and to remove this stagnation of action. Like, we can't just know something's a problem and not deal with it. If you know it's a problem, we all can do something to fix it.
We want to put up the website for the organization that you created as a resource for people who have more questions. Yes, blackhomesmatter.org. That's fantastic. And what are you going to ask the Maryland General Assembly to do? Have you already talked to them? What kind of policy changes are you expecting them to enforce?
Well, a few months ago, there was a meeting across the General Assembly with other stakeholders across the state to talk about this issue. And that prompted our delegate here, Marvin Holmes, to introduce a bill that would look to create a task force in the state, much like the paid task force, interagency task force in the federal level. And so that bill was introduced about 2 weeks ago, I think, and it was voted in favor of as early, I think, on Sunday. And that's step one from a state legislative level, is to convene homeowners, legislators, realtors, appraisers, and others to understand like how look at it from a national landscape. Let's look at this from a statewide landscape to then say these are the actions that need to be taken.
Wonderful. Austin?
Yeah, just two questions. It's one thing, Cassius and Jackie, to read about this, to see it on, news reports, but it's another thing to experience this. How has this impacted you both professionally and personally?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I guess when you look at it, how does it impact you? Really, it impacted us in a way to take action. I give a lot of credit to my wife. My first course of action was to try and right the wrong as it pertained to us, right? How do I go out in the marketplace and try and pull comparables? How do I connect with a realtor? How do I ensure that the appraisal I received, I kind of review it thoroughly to ensure they didn't leave out the bedroom? They had the square footage correctly. So my first effort was to make sure I tried to right the wrongs pertaining to me. But as we talked to others, my wife got behind it and realized that this is something that's prevalent, particular amongst our neighbors, but then outside of that. So you say, how has it affected us? It's kind of affected us to the extent of you kind of have some adrenaline and momentum to try and change it, right? And try and fix it. And so that's probably the biggest motivation for us, is try and correct the wrong, because you think about the amount of wealth that's lost in African-American communities because the home values have been depressed as far as their value.
Mm-hmm.
When you start to think about that, the number of new businesses that could have been started. You think about a number of folks that could have funded their education. You think about just household expenses, being able to care for a loved one, the amount of resources that have been lost, that hadn't been passed on from one generation to the next because of the homes being devalued, kind of makes you want to take action, quite frankly.
Thank you. And just one final question I'd like to ask of all our folks that I'm a part of interviewing. How do you define generational wealth? And how does your definition differ from that of your parents?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Something my wife actually often talk about. I think generational wealth is it's inherent in the word generational wealth is that you can pass on from one generation to the next. Now, I always say there's monetary wealth, right? With value of assets, and there's also lessons that I think is of greater value. So I extended beyond generational wealth around resources, leaving homes to someone, leaving stock to someone, leaving resources to hopefully make the path a lot smoother for the next generation from a financial perspective. But I also think it extends to knowledge, understanding your rights, everything from a work ethic. So I mean, it extends beyond that. But in most contexts, people look at it from generational wealth is that, hey, when you're not just working for you and your my wife and necessarily my kids, maybe my kids' kids, to put them perhaps on a higher platform to succeed and then pass on to the next generation.
Okay, thank you.
Well, that's really great. We're going to keep up with what you all are doing, particularly in the state of Maryland, because this is really important. And we would ask people if they are having some issues. I mean, would they be able to go to the website, Jacqueline, and just find information? Can they call? Can they, what would you have folks that are having issues similar to this? And there's so many more, but how do they reach out to you?
Absolutely. Our website is blackhomesmatter.org. And on the website, we have tips for consumers before they get an appraisal, as it's happening, and what they can do after. So we want to provide information on all fronts. We're going to also add information to the website related to the PAVE initiative and the action plan. It's comprehensive, and it's a resource that I think that anyone who's involved in home sales, home ownership, appraisals, it doesn't matter what, we all have a stake in this, right? And so we're going to add additional information so that everyone can be informed, because at the end of the day, we say Black homes matter.
And I think it'll be interesting on our part to follow the path to becoming an appraiser. What that looks like and why, what have been the barriers, and what are the opportunities for people that want to pursue that form. And we've got a lot of people out there trying to sell real estate, but there are other jobs in between, right, that we don't necessarily look at. And so hopefully if there is any legislation or anything that needs to be done as relates to that, or just finding where those opportunities are and steering people that way is part of the role that we'd like to be a part of. So we'll be following up on that as well. But we thank you all for your time, for your commitment, and for the information that you provided. And this is a struggle that we have been dealing with since forever. So thanks for picking up the mantle.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All righty. Okay, have a good one. Thank you. Austin, thank you very much. Before we go, I know we've been doing this series, Our House DC, and we're looking at what it takes. We've kind of focused primarily on Black home ownership in wards 7 and 8, but we have had some stories that really went beyond that point, which is what Our House DC will be doing, is looking at all the issues that impact the ability for Blacks to own homes and to stay in their homes. But you want to talk about what what next week's newsletter will contain?
Yeah, well, thank you, Denise, and I'll be brief. On March 9th, with the Washington Informer, in conjunction with the DC Office of Tax, Revenue, and Assessments, did a program on a community conversation on property taxes and assessments. I'm pleased to say we had 70 individuals who participated, and our next issue of Our House DC will come out on Monday, and we will go into detail about that conversation. And upcoming stories include 7 months after being displaced on Talbot Street. Where are they now? That will be a follow-up story. That is a story that we did in September. We're going to be doing a story on homeowner lender disparities for Blacks in the district. and defining and building generational wealth.
All right. And we may even look at that topic that you asked, or the Priestley's talked about earlier. If you're 20 years old and trying to buy a home, or 25 or 30 years old trying to buy a home, and finding something that's affordable, not only in the district now, but DC, Maryland, and Virginia is a real challenge. So we may look at some of those millennial homeowners and find out how they've been able to get their piece of the rock despite all the odds. So looking
Agreed.
forward to what we're going to do. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for your
Austin.
time. Appreciate
All
you.
righty.